Thank you, Joe. I've attended a number of Week of Missions, but somehow I never envisioned that I would be one of the guys up here on the stage, and I just want to thank you for giving me the opportunity. You know, people often ask me not only what do you do, but they also ask me, how did you become a missionary, and how did you become involved in ministry? And that is one of the mysteries of the universe. The truth is that I did not intend to become a missionary. I didn't want or plan to become a preaching elder. 40 years ago, if you had told me that I would be standing in front of a group like this, I would have been horrified. And if you had come to tell me that I would eventually come to enjoy speaking to churches, I would have said, "You're crazy." After all, I'm an introvert. I'm shy. Even after all these years, it's still difficult for me to meet new people. And yet, God has a sense of humor. Today, I preach and teach almost every Sunday, not just here in the States in the English language, but also at least twice a week via video teleconferencing to Pakistan in the Urdu language. When I visit Pakistan, I speak and teach in the churches there as well. So how did this come about? How did this shy, introverted, supremely unqualified person now become someone who's leading a church in Portland, Oregon, and directing a mission group which produces media in the Urdu language? Well, it started with my father. When my dad came to know Jesus, he developed a burning passion to tell others about Christ. And that passion led him to Bible college down in San Jose. And after he graduated there, he was involved in church planting. And he had heard about Islam in school very briefly. And he developed this idea, this thing that just wouldn't let him go. Somebody ought to be telling Muslims about Jesus. He eventually went to the University of Pennsylvania, which at that time was the only school in the U.S. that had any courses, any program to do with South Asia. And he got a master's degree in South Asia studies and eventually took our family to Pakistan. And that decision was not an easy one because he was very satisfied. He and my mother were very satisfied with the ministry they had here in the States. And not only that, but some of his contemporaries thought that he was crazy. Why go over there when people here in the States need to know about Christ? And why take a young family into an environment like that? But Dad would not be deterred, and in 1960, he put our family on a tramp freighter bound for Karachi, Pakistan. That little kid right there is me. I was almost 5 years old. We ended up in the city of Lahore. This is what Lahore looked like back in 1960. And since those days, the standard of living has improved a great deal, but the city has also grown a great deal. By some estimates, there are now 12 million people living in that one city. Dad's original plan was to work with college students. However, the Lord led him to work in the slums instead. Eventually, people responded to the gospel, and several churches came into being through my parents' efforts. This picture is actually several years into their ministry. If you look carefully, you can see a blonde head there. That is me. I don't know how old I was at the time, but anyway, this is one of the churches my parents started. However, one of the problems that Dad faced was that there were too many opportunities for him to take care of personally. Too many people wanted to hear the message. And so the question was, how can I teach people without being there in person? And so we got the idea of recording messages. And hundreds of people heard the message on tape. This picture is interesting because this little tape player here at the time, this was about 1966 or 67, that tape player at the time was the height of technology. Cassettes had just been invented, and they were very problematic. They were not the reliable things that we were used to in later years, but just horrible problems with them, teething troubles. And so Dad decided reel-to-reel tape players. And this was the height of technology because it didn't use vacuum tubes. It was transistorized. At that time, CDs had not been invented. Personal computers and cell phones were the stuff of science fiction. The mathematical underpinnings of the MP3 file format were at least 10 years in the future. So technology has moved a long, long ways since those days. However, many hundreds of people heard the gospel as a result of those tape players. Now, my father was the first person to record messages like this in the Urdu language. FEBA, Far East Broadcasting Associates, heard about what he was doing and invited Dad to turn what he was doing into radio programs. They were building a transmitter station in the Seychelles Islands and said, hey, what you're doing is very close to radio programming anyway. Why don't you supply programs to us? And Dad took up that challenge. We built a recording studio, and he had the foresight to engage some of the top talent in Pakistan of that era. This is Moni Hamid. She was known as the golden voice of Asia, and she recorded a lot of material for us. Salim Raza, who was one of the foremost singers of Pakistan of that day, recorded something like 300 songs for us. By now, I was a teenager, and it was in the studio that I first got involved in mission work. And I found that I had a talent for recording and for editing. As I told the young people, even though technology has changed, I would still be willing to go up against about anybody when it comes to editing quarter-inch tape, provided you allow me to bring my own splicing block along. Our first programs were broadcast in 1971, and it wasn't long before we started hearing from hundreds of listeners. We moved back to the States in 1976 and established a recording studio in Seattle. And, whoops, what happened there? Okay, got ahead of myself here. We've kept recording material in the Urdu language ever since. And in some ways, you can say it was the path of least resistance for me to continue with this. However, I also felt that God was calling me to this. And I just want to throw in something here about God's call. I think that God's calling is essential to anyone who is going to go into ministry. If you are feeling God's call, then you better answer it. Because if you don't, you're going to be miserable. On the other hand, if God is not calling you to ministry, don't try it. Do something else, because God is calling you elsewhere. It's not that God isn't calling each one of us. The question is, what is God calling us to? And you will never be satisfied, you will never be fulfilled until you answer that call in whatever direction it may be. God was calling me to this as much as I didn't want it. Producing radio programs is still central to what we do, though we do many of the same things as we did before. Technology has changed tremendously, and not only in how we record, but in how we deliver content. And the biggest change, of course, is that the internet happened. Now, in addition to the traditional radio stations, which we still use, we have streaming stations on the internet. And this means that instead of one 15-minute program per day, we now have our content up 24/7. And not only can people in Pakistan and northern India hear our programs, but wherever there is an internet connection in the world, people can listen. Another huge change which has happened in our world is the diaspora of Urdu speakers from India and Pakistan, and they are now everywhere throughout the world. I've been amazed at where people have been listening from. We have listeners in South America. Urdu speakers in South America? In Vietnam? I never would have thought of that. The internet opens up other possibilities as well. We have a website for listeners where they can listen to specific programs, not just the stream, but if program so-and-so really touched them, they can go back and listen to it and often download the scripts as well. They can also download literature. We've published several books along the way, and most of them are on the website for download. And we not only do that electronically, but we publish books as well. I'm glad that Doug Reed is here. He's retired from LATM, and it's through LATM that we have been able to publish a lot of our books. We give books to everyone who asks for them. We make them available not only to our listeners, but to everyone who asks. And the website is not only for Urdu speakers. There's an English part to it as well. And the goal is to give practical information which will help people draw closer to God. For example, this shown on the screen is a series of tutorials which I have written. Now think about it. Let's say that through the radio or some other means you hear about Jesus, you give your heart to Christ, somehow you have been baptized into Christ. Now what? There are a lot of places, this might be hard for you to imagine, but there are a lot of places in this world where there are no churches. And let's say that you are in one of those places. What do? You don't have a Christian background. You don't have other Christians around you where you can copy and ask, okay, what do I do? Well, I have a tutorial in here. What do we do about worship? How do you pray? We take it for granted. But let's say that you're a Muslim convert. Your concept of prayer is radically different. How do you address God as your Father? What do you do? So anyway, I've attempted to answer some of these questions through tutorials. I also have a section on frequently asked questions that people have on the Christian faith. Right now, this is being translated into Urdu as well. This will be on the Urdu section of the site as well as the English side. A big question, for example, that Muslims have is, why do you call Jesus the Son of God? How many of you could answer that question satisfactorily? I'm afraid that a lot of Christians couldn't answer that question. We just take it for granted because we've heard it all our lives. But to a Muslim, that's a huge stumbling block. So questions like that are answered here. We're also branching out into other technology. This is an app that I wrote so that people can listen to the streaming stations on their cell phones. This is the old version. It is currently being rewritten. I've just tested the new version, and Lord willing, before the month is out, the new version will be available from the Google Play Store. And this means that if someone does not have access to a radio, they can easily listen to our programs via their cell phone. By the way, this is another huge technological change which has occurred in our world. One time when I was in Pakistan, there was a joke going around, and the joke was this, that when a baby is born, the first thing that happens, they put a cell phone in its hand. And that was a takeoff on the Muslim custom of, when a baby is born, the very first thing they do is give the call to prayer. So that's the first thing a baby hears. So now it's a cell phone. And there's a lot of truth to it. Fawn and I were amazed the last time we were in Pakistan just how widespread cell phones are, and the majority of them are smartphones. And so the app is essential because the cell phone has now become the new radio that people are using. There's another technology that we're experimenting with, and it is in the experimental stage, but Wi-Fi hotspots. Now, these are little boxes that has all of our content on it, and people can access these things via Wi-Fi. And the advantage of this is that people do not incur data charges, for one thing. If you use the app or you're going to get data charges. But you're not going to get any data charges here. And the other thing is this is very, very hard to track. Authorities who might be listening in cannot tell, where you're getting this material. And people are using these things in ways that I had not anticipated. I'll talk about that in just a little bit. Technology has also changed how people respond to our programs. It used to be letters, now it's texts or voicemail. Here's what one person had to say. I just listened to your program, Khuda Ki Talash, and I'm very much amazed. The way you present God is our Heavenly Father. Simply mind-blowing. In just a few minutes, you explained the deep facts of God's fatherhood. I had never experienced such a solid explanation in simple words. Here's another response. This one's from a Muslim. I always thought that the way the Holy Quran highlighted the 99 names of Allah, no other religion or book came close. But after listening your inspiring program, I have no hesitation to confess as a Muslim that you certainly opened my mind. Why and how God is a loving Father, a loving God, and how we respond to God's love. Obviously, this is a new experience for me. I am raised in a very religious Muslim family. Taking interest in Christian teaching or books is not acceptable. But I can't ignore the beautifully presented, truthful program, Khuda Ki Talash. Over the years, my role has changed. I still do technical work, but my father started having me write programs as well. And then, as we traveled back to Pakistan, I found that the churches expected not just him, but me also to speak. Oh no, not me. But I had to do it, or otherwise I would negate the entire purpose of the trip, because they would be highly offended if I didn't. And as Dad got older, he eventually dropped out of the daily administration, and the board appointed me as director in his place. And this picture is of me speaking to a church in Pakistan. You might remember that slide several back where my father was speaking to a group in the mud-walled compound. This is the same church. And you can see how their standard of living has improved. There are two parts to the Great Commission. The first part is to go and make disciples. And the second part is teaching them all things that I have commanded you. My father had a passion for the first part of the commission. He was an evangelist to the core and thought everybody else ought to be an evangelist also. But my gifting is not in that area. I am not an evangelist. I still have a lot of difficulty meeting new people and introducing them to Christ. But I have found over the years that I have a passion for the second part of the commission, teaching, and that is where my gifting lies. Here I am teaching a seminar for church leaders in Pakistan in 2009. There were leaders from 7 different congregations there, and what was especially wonderful about this particular group was that at least 3 of them were converts from Islam, and they became Christians partially as a result of our broadcast. The last time I was in Pakistan was 2019. COVID upset a lot of plans, but this was just before COVID. And in addition to speaking to 6 different congregations, I taught another 2 seminars for church leaders. And in this one, I was using Barnabas as an example of leadership. And the reason that the slide is in English is because they didn't tell me that I would have a projector available until the very last second, and I didn't have time to prepare Urdu slides. So anyway, the slides were in English, but even though I was speaking in Urdu. My teaching is not limited to when I am in Pakistan. Another wonderful thing about the internet is it enables video conferencing. And I teach at least 2 times a week over the internet to people in Pakistan. Here is a partial list of the courses that I have taught. And some of these are pretty standard, bog standard. Introduction to the Bible, writing devotionals, a personal statement of faith, preparing communion meditations. That's a huge one, by the way. Totally against the church culture over there. And it's a concept that I've had to introduce. And okay, guys, here's one way that you can judge somebody's potential. Do they have the ability to speak? How are they in Bible study and so forth? That also is one of the tutorials that's on the website, how to prepare a communion meditation. It's something a lot of American churches could learn from too. Expository speaking, survey the New Testament, the church, Acts. And you might say, map reading? What in the world is map reading doing in a course for church leaders? Well, it was not something that I had intended to teach, I'll tell you that. But I was teaching a course on the book of Acts at their request. And I told them before we began this course, I said, guys, you need to get a hold of some maps because you're not going to really understand what's going on in the book of Acts unless you can see, where these places are. And I told them where to obtain the maps and all that. And they went out and got them. But as the course went along, I was a little bit miffed, actually. They seemed to be very reluctant to use the maps. I would ask a question, well, do you have your map? Well, yeah, well, I fetch it, and why isn't it in front of you? And then one day, one of my students asked a question, and I thought it was very obvious. I said, well, look at your map. It's dead silence for about 10 or 15 seconds at least. And then finally, he stuttered and said, I don't know what I'm looking at. I don't know how to read a map. And this was a semi-literate fellow. He learned to read as an adult. And I thought, okay, I can make allowances for that. But then a college grad piped up and says, I don't know how to read a map either. And nobody in the group knew how to read a map. And so the book of Acts comes to a screeching halt, and I had to develop a crash course in map reading. The point being that when we are going to the nations, when we are trying to teach other people, we have an agenda. But we need to set our agenda aside sometimes and teach people what they need rather than what we want to teach. Anyway, that's how map reading got on the list. What is the purpose? The purpose is to enable people to take the message further forward. And here one of my students is baptizing, and here is a house church that he started. This church is particularly dear to my heart, and what makes it special is that this is a 4th generation church. It is started by people who learned from people who learned from people who my father converted. And when Fawn and I were there in 2019, it was just wonderful to see the love in this particular group. And it was also wonderful to see how other church leaders had cooperated to bring this congregation into being. But the story doesn't stop here. I just learned that people from a neighboring village have asked this church to help them. And so far, there have been 10 baptisms in this place. And a new church is coming into being, and this will be a 5th generation church. Okay, so what does the future hold? We live in a time of disruptive change. I'll be talking about this more in my second presentation. But the world that we live in is a very, very different world than it was even 20 or 30 years ago. The changes are so profound, and they are occurring so rapidly that no one really knows what the future holds. We don't know what our world is going to look like in another 10, 20, 30 years. And what makes things so unsettling that these waves of change are not coming singly, but they're coming all at once. We're being hit with changes in the areas of how society views basic ethics and morality, how people view and define family. We're just starting to feel the impact of the digital revolution on how we work and how we study and how we entertain ourselves and so forth, how we interact with one another. There are huge changes occurring in world populations. I don't know if you're aware of it, but there are several places in the world that are experiencing or just on the edge of a population crash. And we have no idea how this is going to really affect geopolitics and the mission field as time goes forward. And on top of everything else, we're at a turning in the normal generational cycle. A new generation is coming up who looks at the world very, very differently than we do. Now, the reason I bring this up is that change is not only hitting us here in the States, but change is also occurring on the mission field. In Pakistan, things are very different than they used to be when we lived there. So Pakistani society is going two different directions. On the one hand, you have the Muslim radicals, and they are becoming even more radical, and they want to abolish the secular government and establish Sharia law. On the other hand, you have a large number of Pakistani society, Muslims in the country, who are fed up with Islam. They are tired of it. They see the inconsistencies of it, and they say, we want something different. And they are turning away from Islam. And unfortunately, we have not done a good enough job in giving them an alternative. Instead of turning towards Christ, they are turning towards atheism. They have not been given a believable alternative to what they see in Islam. What they have heard about Jesus is far from accurate or attractive. How can we take advantage of this? Well, one way that we can take advantage of it is preparing media programs for them that will give them the answers that they're looking for. I read you a couple of responses from that program series, Khuda Ki Talash. That was a program series on the attributes of God. Because the God that we worship is a far different God than the Muslim is aware of. Muslims think of God as a harsh, indifferent, and cruel taskmaster, really, whereas we know him as a loving Father. Huge difference in perspective, and that's why we produced this program. And the response was amazing. We never thought of God like that. And I want to produce more programs that will appeal specifically to Muslims. One program series I'm writing right now is on the prophets. Muslims revere the prophets, many of the same prophets that we revere. But they know nothing about them, really. And the goal of this series is to tell them about the prophets, yes, but how the prophets actually point to the supreme prophet, who is not Muhammad, but Jesus Christ. Things are also changing in the Christian community in Pakistan. On the one hand, they have unprecedented freedom, far more freedom than they had when we lived in Pakistan. For example, when we lived there, Christians were given 1 hour per year on national media at Christmas time. And now Christians are routinely asked on national media to give their views or opinions on various topics and subjects. In some ways, the churches there are freer to worship than we are here. Just one little anecdote. My dad and I think it was on the last trip that he made to Pakistan, we were invited to go to and speak at a church, and our schedule was such that we could only be there on Friday. Friday is the Muslim day of worship. And we arrived at this little church building, and I was dismayed to see that they had hired a sound system. They had rented one. And not only did they have a loudspeaker inside this little room, which really didn't need it, but they had put one of the loudspeakers outside so that the entire neighborhood could hear the sermon. It's a rather interesting experience to be speaking to a church, competing with the mosque, not only the call to prayer, but the mullah's sermon, which is going on at the same time. You couldn't get away with that here. You try putting a loudspeaker outside your church building and see what happens. So on the one hand, they have unprecedented freedom. But on the other hand, they're also in danger. I'm sure that all of you have heard about the blasphemy law. It's a very poorly written law. It doesn't define what blasphemy is, and there are no penalties for false accusations. And therefore, if I have a grudge against you, I can accuse you of saying something derogatory about Islam, Muhammad, or the Quran, and you're in trouble. If the mob doesn't get to you first, you can be incarcerated for years, and ultimately, if you're found guilty, be executed. And so Christians have that hanging over their heads all the time. And so it creates a lot of fear, and they fear to step across the boundary and talk to their Muslim friends and neighbors. And so we need to pray for them, that they will have the courage of Christ to go and step across that border. One of the things I'm stressing in my classes to church leaders is the need to continually train others so that if the worst does happen, there will be others to take their place. I want churches to be like the churches we read about in Acts chapter 8, when the persecution broke out in Jerusalem and everybody scattered. But instead of keeping quiet like you would think they would do, what do? They talked about Jesus everywhere they went. And that's one of my goals for the churches in Pakistan, that no matter what happens, nobody will be able to extinguish the message. They need to raise up others who can take their place. In summary, it's more important than ever that we continue to utilize mass media, because mass media has the ability to reach into places we could never go ourselves. Supposing that you could gain resident status in Pakistan, there are huge areas you cannot go. As a foreigner, I'm now restricted from traveling in certain areas. But even if I could travel there, I still could not get into a lot of places. You can't go into a Muslim's home and talk to the women folk, for example. It's not done. It's just not possible. But guess what? Mass media can get there. We've heard from a lot of Muslim women over the years. And how they managed to get the message out of their house, I don't know, but they have. People are listening, even though you cannot get there personally. There's another use of mass media that I just learned about. And this is something the Pakistani brothers came up with. I hate social media. I'm an introvert, I told you. And, the whole idea of social media just turns me off. I do not have a Facebook account. Well, in theory, I do, but I haven't looked at it in probably 10 years. I don't even know what the password is. I might as well not have it. I don't have any other social media accounts. But over in Pakistan, it seems like everybody does. And one of the guys that I'm working with, he just told me this the other day. He downloads one of our programs each day and then shoots it out to his WhatsApp group. And he has over 600 people in his group. And what's more, I found out that some of those people shoot the same program out to their groups. And one of those groups, this tertiary group, has over 1,000 people in it. And where it's going from there, I have no idea. But we're starting to hear, trickle back, feedback. It's trickling in. Yeah, thank you for sending in that program. That's really great, and that's convicting. And I don't know these people, but because of these guys' social media groups, the message is going out even further, and so it's reaching places that I never dreamed of. We need to keep producing programs for mass media because God uses it in amazing ways. But on the other hand, the face-to-face mentoring, the face-to-face interaction is also essential. And we at Key Communications are determined to do both of those things, both continue with the mass media, but also the interpersonal contact and the personal teaching. And I'm convinced that by doing both of these things, the kingdom of God will advance in that land. Thank you very much.